Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to virtually meet all of you. Thank you so much for having me. I would like to thank the faculty members at NSS College Shartila for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Silpa Satheesh, and I am currently the Assistant Director of Research and Policy at Thanal Trust, an environmental NGO in Trivandrum. I hold a Ph.D. in Sociology from University of South Florida, and my primary areas of specialization are environmental sociology, social movements, sociology of development, and political economy. I'm basically a qualitative researcher. I use methods such as ethnography and document analysis. Within ethnography, I use methods such as in-depth interviews, participant observation, conversational interviews, etc. to unpack my research questions. My dissertation project was on a case of labor and environmental conflicts in Elur-Edair industrial belt. But please don't worry, I'm not planning to bore you by talking a lot about my dissertation project. The title of today's talk is Environment, Development and Social Movements, and I'll briefly explain why I have given this title and what is the relevance. Before I do so, I really hope all of you are doing well and safe. Please take care and stay safe during these pandemic times. So I'd like to give a brief overview of what I'd like to present today. My goal is primarily to challenge or question the mainstream or traditional definitions of economic growth and development from an environmental standpoint. And in doing so, I'd also like to introduce you to the world of social movements and explore how people organize collective action to fight against and resolve environmental problems. So you might want to ask me, what is the relevance of this discussion? Why are we even discussing this? One, we are currently experiencing a climate crisis. Climate change is real and we are all facing the fallouts of climate disruption across the world. We are also currently living in a geological era called Anthropocene, which signifies the impact of human action on climate change and the role of human beings in creating the current climate crisis. Anthropocene recognizes the anthropogenic nature of climate change, which means Anthropocene clearly attributes the blame for current climate crisis on human actions. And when we say human action, it is also important for us to evaluate the extent to which our forms of production or organization of economy has contributed to this crisis. Additionally, in the context of Kerala, we experienced the deluge in 2018, and so now it's also real. It is not something that is going to happen in the future, right? Climate disruptions are becoming a norm rather than exception for all of us. And research also shows that countries in the global south, particularly countries such as India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., are highly vulnerable to adverse weather events that are created due to climate change. So it is in this backdrop that we are exploring whether the definitions of economic growth or the way in which we organize production contribute further to environmental crisis. Also, we cannot ignore the many environmental movements that are happening across the world. Many of these environmental movements are vocally calling out the exploitative nature of production and how it damages the environment, and many times destroying their lives and daily livelihoods. So it is in this backdrop that we decide to embark upon this question, like environment, development, and social movements. How are they connected? The interface between these three processes. If you look at the traditional and more mainstream theories of economic growth and development, we can see they often portray growth as an imperative for progress and prosperity. Theories such as the stages of economic growth define it in terms of a shift from a traditional society to a more modern industrial society that would ultimately culminate with high mass consumption. So consumption is often portrayed as a desirable quality. In here, growth is also defined as the vehicle of modernization and development. There have been many critics to this idea of growth as a limitless process because we live in a planet with finite resources. Hence, it is not practically possible for us to envision growth as an infinite process which can continue without any impediments. The limits to growth report is one of the major critics that called out that it is not possible for us. It is not practically possible for us to consider limitless economic growth as a goal for prosperity. So initial critics such as limits to growth, when they pointed out the need to slow down the process of economic growth or slow down the rate of economic growth, more recent critics such as degrowth, they propose an alternative economy that is based on downscaling of production and consumption, which is a radical shift from how we have learned economics for all these years. So degrowth is a new theoretical standpoint, particularly adopted by environmental justice movements, where they say that we cannot continue to embark on this path where we envision more growth for all countries. We cannot all consume like an average American, and that should not be our goal ultimately if we have sustainability in our minds. So this theoretical school of thought proposes the idea that we have to de-escalate this process. We have to reconceive production and we have to envision prosperity without producing more and without consuming more. So in a way we can see that these critics, which is like a radical critic to the existing theories of economic growth, they are asking for a switch or shift away from a productivist economy, right, where we produce more and sell more and buy more. That's the basic economic logic. Instead of that, they are shifting more to a convivialist model where you start valuing well-being, happiness, and other indicators which move beyond GDP and the production of more goods in the economy. And when you look at the mainstream neoclassical economic theories, you would see how it kind of prioritizes profits, right? Profit is a dominant aspect and almost a desirable aspect of production in everything we have learned in economics. In other words, basic economic theories or mainstream economic theories in particular, it normalizes profits. Like almost all theories assume that the primary motive or goal of every firm is profit maximization, right? And in doing so, it is naturalizing this process or normalizing this process that wanting to have more profits is completely okay. Theorists, particularly radical political economists and heterodox economists, have called this out. They have critiqued and explained how this is problematic in legitimizing capitalist system of production. When you say profits are normal, you're essentially saying that it's also okay to exploit, right? Exploitation is normal and appropriation of surplus value is also normal. So in this backdrop, it is also important that we situate the debate surrounding degrowth. So this is not a settled debate, right? This is an emergent debate. You might as well join this debate and read more about it. You don't have to agree with me right on top of everything I say, but this is just a beginning of a conversation where you also start thinking about what this idea of degrowth is all about and how it proposes an alternative to current set of theories that legitimizes capitalism. And you now have an alternative radical theory that kind of goes against or calls out capitalist exploitation. So in that sense, the theories of degrowth are trying to present an alternative to this capitalist model of exploitation. And when you talk about capitalist exploitation, you must have already learned in your economic classes how capitalists extract surplus value, right, from labor. And the exploitation of capital is not just confined to the site of production. It moves beyond the site, right? And one of the important implications of capitalist production and accumulation is the impact it has on the environment. So in traditional Marxian sense, we say that capitalism is essentially destroying the conditions of production because nature is often considered as an input. So when you destroy environment as a result of industrial production, you're also destroying the chances for sustaining your own system of production. So that's a contradiction again in a capitalist system. So here they are trying to call out this exploitative system and they're proposing an alternative that is not obsessed with economic growth and not obsessed with producing more and consuming more. And this is also an idea that is increasingly being adopted by environmental movements. So this is an idea of decentralization, right? Instead of a centralized, globalized production of things, they are pushing for more decentralized production of goods and services so that we can reduce our emission footprint, that we are not transporting food. I'm not sure if you have seen a recent forward on social media where you can see a packet of peaches. They were harvested in somewhere in Latin America, but they were shipped all the way to Thailand just for packing and processing, and they were shipped back to the United States. So imagine the distance that this food, the pack of peaches would travel, so that the supply chain is so complicated that it ends up producing a lot of emissions. Even when we talk about economic development, which is a much broader concept than economic growth, it still requires economic growth. If you go by the traditional mainstream or neoclassical definitions of economic development, it still needs growth, and it is often defined in terms of building, constructing more roads or building more dams. In other words, it does not, or it often overlooks the environmental sustainability of such practices and processes. And that's when we started having this debate about making this process sustainable, hence the idea of sustainable development, that we are planning to undertake development by also taking the planetary limit into account. And here I'm also not talking about Sen's idea of capabilities approach, where he defines development in terms of freedom, etc. That's not what I'm trying to critique here. It's the traditional understanding of development as, again, this process of modernization, where it is desirable to transition from a traditional agrarian economy to a more modern industrial economy. That is considered as desirable. Here again, there is a trade-off. So if this is how you're planning to define progress, then there is an inevitable trade-off between environment and development, because the more you develop, the more destruction and damage you would inflict on the environment, and hence there is a trade-off. Much of the environmental social movement that we see today is actually calling out this trade-off. They are at the receiving end of these environmental externalities. So in this backdrop, it is important that we reevaluate what we have already learned about economic development and what we continue to teach about economic development when we see people who are already socially and economically marginalized, who are already standing at the margins, and they're experiencing these fallouts from the development projects that we undertake. So we promise that there would be prosperity, but who is paying for that prosperity? There are people who are disproportionately receiving all these environmental burdens associated with economic development. So it is in this backdrop that the rest of this presentation will be talking about social movements. And when this happens to you, when there is a development project that puts disproportionate environmental burdens on you, what would you do? Why would people come together and fight against that? And what exactly is the process through which they would do that? And that brings us to the most exciting topic, social movements. So what exactly are social movements? Social movements are essentially an organized form of collective action where people band together, and most of the participants will have or share a common goal regarding a social, economic, or environmental problem. So they would have certain demands. They would also propose certain solutions to ameliorate the problem they have identified. Movements are immensely powerful in terms of bringing about social change. If we look at the history of humanity, most of the things we enjoy today, such as a 5-day work week, 8-hour workday, all of these things came to us because of very powerful social movements in the history of humanity. So they're extremely powerful, and it's a powerful display of human agency, right? So we often talk about structure and agency even within economics. So whenever we talk about the macro structure, we often portray human beings as these economic actors who does not have control beyond his individual choice. And social movements show that this is not true. You do have a control to bring about or participate in activities that could bring about social change. And that is exactly what movements have been doing over all these years. And that brings us to the next question. Why do people participate in collective action? And the reason why I'm asking is the traditional assumptions of economics, particularly regarding individual behavior as a consumer, would often advise you that people would not participate in collective action. And I'll come to you in come to this in a brief second. So it is also important to understand, why do people participate in collective action? And that brings us to the free rider problem. Famous American economist Mancur Olson first identified this and said that if there is a social movement and the movement ends up getting some benefits, then individual actors will not have an incentive to participate unless the benefits are only restricted for those people who will participate. In other words, if I am one of the beneficiaries and if I decided not to participate and the benefits would still come to me irrespective of my participating or not participating, what incentive do I have to actually show up on the streets? I do not, right? Because I would get the benefits. So if my union is striking for higher wages, even if I don't participate and if the company decides to give higher wage, I would also get this hike in wages irrespective of my participating or not, hypothetically. Such an argument you must have heard in the context of public goods, right? Maybe in the case of a public road or a street light, people generally do not have an incentive to pay for that because the benefits of that expenditure is not confined to the individual. And the rationale is, since human beings are these rational instrumental agents guided solely by self-interest, a person would have no incentive to spend on something that is enjoyed by other people. The benefits are enjoyed by other people. So this is what the free rider problem says. However, the very existence of social movements kind of negate this proposition, right? That people always free ride. There have been many historic and contemporary examples of social movements where people have put their lives on the line to fight for a cause or fight against the system that they deemed as oppressive. So be it the fight against slavery, be it the fight against untouchability, these are not easy fights. People are putting their lives at risk to fight and end a system that is oppressive. In other words, it is not as simple as Olson proposes it to be. It's not as simple as a simple cost-benefit analysis. It's much more complicated. Human beings or the entire experience of humanity cannot be often reduced to this idea of a rational economic actor. We are not robots, right? We have trust, we have solidarity, we have emotions. Many times we act under these influences as well, right? We are a social being. And emotions play a huge role in the context of social movements. And that brings us to environmental social movements, which is just one type of social movements. In the context of an environmental social movement, people come together and they recognize that they all share an environmental grievance. They are fighting against environmental harm or an environmental damage that is perhaps created by development projects or through industrial pollution. Essentially, they share this collective identity as victims of an environmental damage. It could be pollution or something else, but they share this grievance and that grievance brings them together. So they come together to fight against the environmental injustice, at the same time demanding solutions to fix the problem. There have been many examples of environmental social movements in Kerala. The one that I've shown on screen is from Elur, and as the banner shows, it's a fight, it's a protest march, and people are calling for some action so that the pollution in River Periyar is put to an end. So they are essentially calling the agency, the authorities to do something or to intervene so that the release of industrial effluents into the river is controlled. If we look at Kerala's movement landscape, like I said before, we can see a long series of environmental struggles. In fact, the landscape is replete with such struggles. And it is important to notice that most of these movements are fighting against the environmental burdens created by development projects. And these development projects can either be state-sponsored projects or industrial development projects or other corporate models of development where the burdens were disproportionately distributed on the poor and marginalized sections of society. In that sense, it would also be a mistake to categorize these environmental struggles as a middle-class phenomenon because most of these struggles are led by poor and marginalized sections of society. It is also important to recognize the conservation or the damage inflicted as a result of economic development as an occupational issue, as an issue of economic well-being, because for many people, their livelihoods are directly dependent on the availability of clean and safe natural resources. If you look at an inland fish worker or farm worker, the livelihood sustainability is highly dependent on the availability of certain natural resources. So by inflicting damage on the environment, you're also jeopardizing the prospects of their economic living. So it is not just about conservation, but it's also about securing the livelihoods of people who directly depend upon natural resources. It is also important to understand the different systems of valuations with which we approach natural resources. And it again challenges this generalized understanding or categorization that restricts human beings into this one single block. This is how all human beings think. That's not true. And the following vignettes kind of show you how people make sense of economic development in a way that is distinctly different from our dominant understanding of what development should be. The vignette shown on screen is is in the backdrop of the Shantivanam protest that happened in Ernakulam. I hope some of you would be remembering this because it was a human-grown forest at the heart of the city where many trees were ordered to cut down to install KSEB posts. So the owner of this forest put up a sturdy fight against KSEB, and despite the person's fight, the KSEB went ahead and installed the post. So on the day of installing post, the person said the following, that's shown on screen. Let me read it quickly. See, they are cutting the tree canopies. They are beheading the trees. And I cannot protest by beheading myself, so I am cutting my hair in protest. Dear Chief Minister, comrade, I have raised slogan for this party and am dedicating my hair to the same party. You all should remember this when you set out to build green islands in our state. I am giving this as a trophy for your environmentalism. They are building green islands so that they can later plunder them in the name of development. Look at me, this is what I'm going, or this is what I got trying to conserve biodiversity. So the excerpt that I've presented on screen vividly explains, the disconnect between our commitment to environmentalism in paper and what we do in practice. So the environmentalists essentially problematizing that. And when the person says that, they are also trying to say how efforts to conserve biodiversity is often not rewarded but punished in the state. And the narrative again frames all of this in the backdrop of development, that the root cause of all of this, according to the protester, is development. Moving on to the next slide, you can see an image from Wiley protest that happened in Kannur in 2018. So here the protest was against a state-sponsored national highway widening project, where the state had decided to take over farmlands as part of this NH widening project. The people and the farmers in particular actively resisted this project, saying that it would lead to the loss of more than 250 acres of wetland and also the wetland ecosystem associated with that. The excerpt is very interesting in terms of the different valuation and the way in which people value or attribute value to natural resources. The excerpt features the words of Namrata Janagi, who was one of the frontline leaders of Wiley protest. Holding petrol in plastic bottles, the Wiley protesters assembled in the Kiratur paddy fields. The protesters threatened to immolate themselves if the state decides to move forward with the proposed highway widening project that would fill up 250 acres of paddy land. Namrata Janagi, a veteran leader in the front lines of the movement, was strong in her words as ever when she said, "We will fight till we die. Food and water are important. Water. Every other thing should come after that. We are fighting for our water." As the excerpt here shows again, the way in which we attribute value is extremely different when we define development. For the state, it was important to widen the national highway by acquiring the farmland, but for the protesters or the farmers in Kiratur farm, it was important to conserve their only source of clean drinking water, which was the farmland. It was a wetland. In other words, our valuation systems are not the same. They are not homogeneous. Many times, through these struggles, environmentalists and environmental activists call out the faulty lines along which we attribute value only along monetary lines. It also shows the importance of emotions, and also the excerpt that I showed before. It's a highly emotional display of protest. It's a performance, right, in that sense. Performance not in a theatrical sense, but performance in a sense of these heightened emotions where a set of people are trying to protect the environment, where they have to even fight against the state. The cases we considered before clearly exemplifies how there are many definitions of development. It also shows how the local environmental movement actively resists and challenges the dominant understandings, idioms, and practices of economic development. And that's why when the state pushes to widen the road, the Wiley protesters fight to preserve the water resources. And that's why when the industries push to expand along the banks of River Periyar, the people in Elur and Idayar fight to save the river and preserve the drinking water sources. And that's why when KSEB plans to expand infrastructure by cutting down trees, the owner of Shantivanam decides to fight for keeping biodiversity. In other words, there are different schemes of valuation at operation here, and not all of them attribute value to natural resources in the similar way. In other words, it would be a mistake to reduce all of this decision making using the framework of instrumental rationality that is guided by individual self-interest. To conclude, the presentation was an invitation to engage in a brief evaluation of the standard economic definition surrounding economic growth and development from an environmental standpoint. And I believe we saw how there is a trade-off between economic development defined in the traditional sense and environmental sustainability. And the replete presence of environmental social movements highlight the problematics of such traditional academic definitions surrounding economic growth, and they highlight the need to adjust them to comply with the reality of these people. It would be a mistake for disciplines to overlook the reality when people on the margins challenge the dominant academic definitions surrounding concepts such as economic growth and development. And this is extremely important when there is an emergence and ongoing discourse surrounding degrowth. So I believe it helped you have some insights about the critics of development from the standpoint of environment and environmental social movements. And I'm really sorry if I've bored you. It could be boring because it's a monologue and you don't get to interject me. I have no words to thank you for your patience, and if you have any questions or critics, feel free to email me. I've given my email address at the beginning of this presentation. Thank you so much for having me one more time. Please take care and stay well.